Welcome back. As I said, we're taking a special hour here to talk about some things that have been going on. I just was reading some comments by Jeff Sessions that were made in 2000. So I do want to cut some slack in terms of, I hope that he has changed his mind about IDEA, because if you read his whole report, he feels like it's one of the biggest problems in the American school system, that IDEA is preventing us from being able to punish behavior out of children who are have any kind of special need or have any kind of challenging behavior, and specifically cites that we should be able to expel them and take them out of school, which we all know is a recipe for disaster, and that we shouldn't have a double standard, that we shouldn't be taking kids out of school when they have challenging behavior. We should find ways of changing the challenging behavior. One of the things that happened for me when I began to meet behavior analysts, people who are well versed in ABA, I learned that it is never the child's fault. In fact, assigning blame for challenging behavior is futile. It's like going to the hardware store and looking for spaghetti and milk. Not wise, right? Instead, we need to take apart the behavior and figure out where have things gone awry. We talk a lot on this show about the ABCs of behavior. A, and this is for any behavior exhibited by anyone ever, right? There's always the A, which is the antecedent. Something happens, right? And then there is the B, the behavior happens as a result of whatever the antecedent was. And then there's the C, which is the consequence for the behavior. Now, in our society, really, if you think about this, we're all well versed in this. We just don't think about it in terms of the ABC. We all engage in this 300 million times a day. And as teachers and as parents and other people, we certainly we're all about that C, the consequence, because we have been raised and brought up in a society that's all about punishment. Well, punishment is a consequence strategy. And here's the thing about punishment. Sometimes punishment is effective, but so fewer times than we are led to believe, because we're immediate, like, let's punish that behavior. That'll change it. And yet we see that punishment is not an effective strategy when we really want to change behavior, except in very specific circumstances. And it has to be done in exactly the right way, because even if it would have been effective, if it's not delivered in the right way, it's not effective. What we find is effective much more often and requires much less expertise are strategies that are positive instead of punishing, right? And that we can eliminate a lot of challenging behavior by looking at what the antecedent is and changing the circumstances around the antecedent. That's actually really effective at changing a lot of behaviors. And some behaviors still are very effective with a consequence behavior, but what we find is giving a reward for good behavior, the absence of the challenging behavior, is much more effective than punishing consequences. And this is true in the classroom, okay? But a lot of times, because what we've been trained to is just punish, we don't even ask ourselves questions about, why is that behavior happening? Great book that I want to encourage anybody out there, parent, teacher, school administrator, mommy, I wish I could tell you what they did to me in school. Richard Strip, great book, read it. It's very, very enlightening. And it really brings home, because a story is told about, I think it's 9 different children, and they tell you what happened at school, and it sounds horrible. This child took off his shoes and he threw them at the teacher, and it sounds like, oh man, that's some challenging behavior, and you hear what happened as a consequence, right? But then Richard writes it from the point of view of the child, if the child had words to speak, and you go, oh, that's what was going on, right? And it really brings home that anytime there's behavior, there's something going on. In the case of the child taking and throwing his shoes, because he wasn't verbal and couldn't say, I have to go to the bathroom. And so nobody was listening to him. So all he had was his shoes to take his shoes and throw them. So we need to look at why behavior is happening. And the most basic principle is to understand that all behavior happens for a reason, especially if it's behavior that happens again and again and again. And you hear teachers talking realistically about kids who are in the classroom who are constantly doing challenging behaviors. So we know that there is a reason for that behavior, and it is almost always there is a form of a paycheck for the child or the person engaged in the behavior, and that's why they're doing it. Because otherwise, why would they, right? So, and we need to know what the paycheck is for that behavior, and we need to cut off the supply of that paycheck and have there be a different paycheck that goes for the appropriate behavior. I know it sounds ridiculously, stupidly easy. It isn't. Because it takes some finesse and some working and some trial and some error, and you have to kind of be Sherlock Holmes, and you have to be willing to try stuff. But the fact of the matter is, that's what works, not sending them home. And we'll talk about exactly why. So when we look at what the paycheck is for the behavior, there's a very specific way that we can do that professionally that's called an FBA, a functional behavior assessment. For anyone who is a parent who's watching, whose child is engaging in challenging behavior, don't hesitate right now. Send an email to your IEP team and say, I want an FBA done on this behavior. Legally, they have to do it. If you are a teacher and you've got somebody in your classroom who is exhibiting challenging behavior, request an FBA so that they come in and they can find what the challenging behavior is. Because when you assume, you leave room for error, right? I always say, when our car breaks down and something isn't working in our car, we don't just start pulling things out and going, I'll try the whole thing and I'll do it myself, right? We take it to a mechanic. And what does the mechanic do? The mechanic says, I'm going to drive it around the block and I'm going to run some tests, some diagnostics, so I figure out what's going on, because I'm not going to pull out your carburetor unless I know that it's the carburetor. We want to apply those same standards to dealing with challenging behavior. But having said that, there are some smaller things that you can play with while you're waiting for an FBA with maybe other kids in the classroom to see how powerful this stuff is, okay? But first we have to talk about what the 4 usual suspects are. There are 4 usual reasons why a child will engage in challenging behavior. And if you know what they are and how to react to them, it's the keys to the kingdom. The total keys to the kingdom. Okay, so the most often reason why kids will engage in challenging, and by the way, this is not just kids on the autism spectrum, this is all of us and all of our kids, all human beings, right? These are the 4 usual suspects. So the biggest one, the first one we want to talk about is attention. People do things to get attention. Think about in the classroom, again, former teacher here, these are the kids who are throwing things, right? These are the kids who touch other kids. These are the kids who are cracking jokes. These are the kids who toss their books on the floor. These are the kids that are pests. And I call these kids the bucket half full kids. They are missing something, and we could talk about it endlessly about whose fault it is. The truth of the matter is, it doesn't matter. There are some kids that you never quite get their bucket all the way full. You're constantly having to put attention in it. But here's the deal. When you give those kids attention, they become the best kids in the classroom. You think I don't know what I'm talking about? I absolutely do. I remember after 9/11, when I went back into a high school setting to teach after teaching college for years, and I said, I want to make more of a difference. And my first day there, one of the students, I was up in front of the class and lecturing, and I felt something go whoosh by my head, and I heard this thwack, and I turned around, and now there's a big crack in the center of my blackboard, my chalkboard, that wasn't there before, and there is a AA battery laying on the floor. Student in the back of the classroom threw a battery at my head so hard that it cracked the blackboard. And I was like, oh, well, that's some serious business, right? And, fast forward a year later, and that same student was on the honor roll. Same student was on the honor roll because I got some training and some help and support to realize that he believed that I was going to leave and it was just a matter of time, and he was going to hurry it up because everybody had left him his entire life. He wanted some attention, and he was going to get it as I left, and he was going to scare me. Except that I made the decision in that moment to react how you're supposed to react when somebody wants attention and engages in bad behavior. You don't give them what they want. So I glanced, I saw the blackboard, I saw the battery. I didn't bend over to pick it up. I just continued on. And I said nothing, did nothing. And on a different day, when he came into the classroom, I made him the project manager of something that we were doing in class. And I said, you're going to sit up here by me. And I gave him something so that he was busy and that I constantly had to check in with him. And I praised him every time he did something right. And in a year, he was on the honor roll. Now, I could have filed a report and gotten him expelled. I'm 100% clear on that. And I can tell you exactly where he would be today, in prison, because that's where he was headed. So this is why this is so important to me. When our kiddos are doing things that are attention driven, we don't ever give attention to the bad behavior. Now, I am not saying that you let them get away with things. If he had hit me with a battery, that would have been a different thing. If he had thrown something a second time, that would have been a different thing. I did if he had hit another student, I could not have ignored that, right? I was okay. The blackboard wasn't. And in that moment, I made a judgment call and said, I know I can turn this around with some help. And I did get some help. And I think that that's an important key thing for teachers as well. But the point is, we don't give attention to the bad behavior because all that does is feed it, right? Instead, we give attention to anything that we can find that's good. And for people who think, oh, you're treating them like snowflakes, I just want to go to what is the goal. Do we want to have more people in the prisons, or do we want to have more productive people in society? And which one works? I know your mind goes, oh, he should have been punished. I get that. But to what end? You can't punish that kind of behavior out. If you could, there would be nobody in prison. And we know that's not the case. Mind shift. This works. It did work. He wasn't the only kid that I had problems with. I had a kid who would sit and he couldn't, I found out later on he couldn't read. So he would sit and he would do things and then he would crumple up papers and he would throw them. Now to me, that's an attention seeking thing. If you're throwing something across the room, you want to get caught. And so for that kid, I did a little bit of research and found out that he loved to draw. He had an A in art and was failing every other class. So you take that interest and you put attention on that. I made him feel capable. And by the time my class was over, he could read. But I had to start by getting him interested and giving him attention. So I had him we were reading a book and I pulled him to the front of the classroom so that I can give more attention, right? And I showered him with attention and I said, I need your help. We're going to read something from this book and I need for you to be the illustrator and draw the picture for it. And he learned to read as a result of that. All right. Oh, we're like running out of time really quickly. Okay. So attention, we don't give attention to the bad behaviors except when there are excruciating circumstances. And that goes into antecedents, and you can find out more about that on another show. There'll be more coming, but you give attention for any time that they do something good. I think you'll see and sometimes you have to set a timer so that every minute you give somebody attention, but giving them attention every minute prevents the bad behavior. And eventually you move it to 1 minute and 10 seconds and 1 minute and 30 seconds, 2 minutes. And eventually you can go the whole class and not have to pay attention to that person because they know they're going to get the attention. Okay. That's the biggest reason for challenging behavior, but the next one is escape. They want out. And when we send them home for bad behavior, guess what we did? We gave them what they wanted. When it's escape maintained, we have to, the antecedent is to build in breaks so that they get breaks. And the other thing that we do is that when we are giving them something to do that they want to escape, we don't let them escape unless they ask appropriately. Hard, but it's doable in the classroom. The third reason why there's challenging behavior, which honestly doesn't happen as much in the classroom, is wanting to have access to someone or something with the littler kids. That's true, but not as much with the older kids. So what we do is we give them an opportunity to have access to that through appropriate behavior, and we never give them access to something for behavior that they don't want to do. Now, the last one is automatically reinforcing. And for our kids that are on the autism spectrum, that is something that we deal with all the time. And guess what? You can't punish that away. There is a need, there is a compulsion to do for this can be kids spitting on their hands and drawing pictures on it. This can be a child picking their nose. You cannot punish that away. Often what works is that we give an incompatible rewarding behavior instead. So if you got a kid who's constantly sticking his finger up his nose, you got to give them something that they enjoy more than picking their nose, that has their hands involved, so that while they're doing whatever that thing is, they're not sticking their finger up their nose, and you reward them for that. That might be Legos for one kid. It might be a Sudoku puzzle for another kid. It could be painting for another kid. But you have to give something that's more rewarding, that makes it impossible for them to do that thing. Because a lot of times in the classroom, it's things that we do with hands. So you'll see that for some kids, we give fidget toys too. Because if I'm playing with my squishy, my finger can't be up my nose. Until we can get them to a point where we can talk about why socially it's not acceptable. But for a lot of kids, that whatever that compulsion is to do, it's huge. It cannot be punished away. And kicking a kid out of school or out of a classroom for those kinds of behaviors is criminal.